Nestled among an area of many historical sites sits the Colonial Parkway, interlocking Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown in the state of Virginia. What was created as an homage to colonial America became the site of multiple brutal murders. This is the case of the Colonial Parkway Murders. Before we begin today's case, I just want to remind everyone that I have a link in the description box down below for case suggestions. If you have a case that you want to see covered on my channel, just follow the link and submit your case. In addition to this, I have provided contact information for today's case down below. If you are interested in what sources I used for today's case, you will find them listed in the pinned comment in the comment section. As there are a number of victims involved in today's case, it is very important that you watch this video in its entirety to hear the stories of each person involved. And now, on to today's case. The Colonial Parkway Murders is a set of cases that may or may not be connected. At least 8 people were murdered on or disappeared from near the Colonial Parkway in Virginia between the year of 1996 and 1989. The case is still unsolved and the families involved in these cases are still seeking answers. To understand this case, we need to briefly go over the Colonial Parkway itself. The Parkway is a 23-mile scenic route linking multiple historic Virginia sites. The parkway also resides in the Colonial National Historical Park, which means that this is situated on federal property. At all times, the parkway is manned by a minimum of 2 park rangers from the National Park Service. Throughout the parkway, there are a lot of pull-offs and memorials and areas that you can stop and enjoy the scenery of the woods and the river. An important thing to note about the parkway is that there are no street lights to help you light your way at night. In addition to this, there aren't any gas stations that you can stop at on the 23-mile route. This means that if you run out of gas or your car breaks down, you're going to be stranded in the parkway. And if this were to happen at night, you would be stuck in the dark. During the day, the route is described as a beautiful location, but at night, people consider it to give a sinister or creepy feel. In a book written about the Parkway Murders, author Blaine Pardoe says, "It gets creepy at night. There's a different crowd. The tourists are gone. We've heard so many stories of partying and peeping toms and creepy cops. It's definitely a shady area." The cases that make up the Colonial Parkway Murders all occurred in pairs. The first to go were Cathleen Thomas and Rebecca Ann Dowski. At the time of her disappearance, Kathleen, who often went by Kathy, was working as a stockbroker in Norfolk. Before this, however, Kathy had been one of the first women to graduate from the Naval Academy in Annapolis. She achieved this dream of hers in 1981, effectively marking herself, her brother, and her father as the first father-brother-sister set to have all graduated from the academy. She had spent a lot of her time in the Navy working as a protocol officer at the Atlantic Fleet headquarters in Norfolk. Kathy was a tough girl, a naval graduate, and was trained in the martial arts. Now, Rebecca Ann Dowski was, at the time of her disappearance, a senior at William and Mary College. She had transferred to the college as a junior and she was studying business administration. Rebecca, who preferred to go by Becky, was described as a bubbly child in her younger years. She had a deep love for people and working with children. Becky often spent her summers babysitting or working at the YMCA in Poughkeepsie, New York, which was where she was from. Kathy and Becky had originally been introduced to each other by an ex-girlfriend of Kathy's. At the time of their disappearance, they had been dating for a few short months. On the evening of October 9th, 1986, Kathy had met Becky at her dorm in Chandler Hall on the William and Mary campus around 7 p.m. From there, the two walked across campus to Barrett Hall, where they spent time with friends in a computer lab. Becky had logged off of the computer there around 8 p.m., and she and Kathy left. At 9:28 that night, Becky logged into the system again to print off a report for a class in Morton Hall. Now, it's unclear where Becky and Kathy went after this. It wasn't unusual for them to take a drive together to spend time alone where they could be free with each other outside the judging eyes of bystanders. Now, the following day, Kathy didn't show up for work in the morning. Though coworkers did notice this, they knew that Kathy had flexible work hours and they didn't think that anything was necessarily wrong. Now, Becky had been planning to visit visit friends at Dickinson College on the 11th, just 2 days after she and Kathy were last seen. Now, when she didn't show up, her friends believed that she had just gone home to Poughkeepsie instead, where she was also intending to spend time with her family. It seems that Becky's schedule around this time was known to be flexible, and she was going to go at her own pace, traveling to see friends and family, and so not seeing her on a specific date didn't strike anyone as odd. Neither Kathy or Becky were reported missing. On October 12th, around 5:30 p.m., a white 1980 Honda Civic was discovered by a jogger. The car was found near the Cheatham Annex Overlook in Williamsburg, Virginia. Though it couldn't be seen from the Colonial Parkway, the jogger was on the bank of the York River, and that way they could actually see the car. It had been pushed down a ravine, which we will discuss again in just a moment. The jogger reported the car to park rangers. Now, what had first appeared to be a car accident proved to be much worse, though. When rangers reached the car, they could see that there was a woman in the backseat and a woman who had been stuffed into the small hatchback space behind that backseat. Now, according to park rangers, they believed or hoped that somebody inside the vehicle may still be alive, so they broke the hatchback's window in an attempt to get to the women inside the car. Once the window had been broken, there was still no response. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Colonial Parkway is on federal property, which means that the FBI has jurisdiction on the parkway. The FBI was called by the park rangers, and when they arrived, they determined that they would have to pull the car back up and out of the ravine to properly search it and retrieve the bodies inside. Now, once the FBI could properly assess the car, they determined that Kathy's body had been stuffed into the hatchback and Becky's body had been in the back seat. Now, there was no sign of sexual assault or robbery. Both women's purses were inside the car, but notably, Kathy's wallet was outside of her purse. The driver's side window had been rolled down. While blood was discovered inside the vehicle, there wasn't enough for the car to have been the crime scene. Kathy and Becky had been murdered somewhere else. It was later determined that the car had been doused in diesel fuel, likely in an attempt to destroy evidence. The accelerant didn't light, however, which may have been when the suspect chose to push the car into the ravine toward the river in the hopes of hiding the car. Now, though there were a large number of prints discovered inside the car, any prints that would have been left by the murderer when closing the hatchback had been destroyed when the park rangers broke the window. According to the autopsies performed on Kathy and Becky, the two had been strangled and their throats slit. There were rope burns on their necks and wrists. This rope was never discovered at the crime scene, but in addition to this, there was a cut across Kathy's hand believed to be a defensive wound. Inside Kathy and Becky's stomachs were meat, cheese, and lettuce, determining that they had eaten some point after leaving the computer labs on the William and Mary campus. It was determined that Kathy and Becky were murdered sometime between 9:30 p.m. on October 9th and midnight on October 10th. According to Kathy's friends, Kathy's ex-girlfriend was investigated in relation to the murders. However, it seemed to these friends that the FBI were more so targeting this woman because she was a lesbian. In the end, there was no connection between Kathy's ex-girlfriend and the murders. On September 19th, 1987, an unlikely pair met for the first time. David Knobling, 20 years old, had taken his brother and cousin to an arcade. David had driven them in his Ford pickup truck, which was extremely important to him. According to his father, after he purchased the vehicle, he spent a lot of time learning everything he could about it and how to take care of it and fix it when problems arose. David had recently acquired a job and was seeming to grow up, which was important because he had recently gotten a girlfriend pregnant. Now, it was during this trip to the arcade, though, that David had met Robin Edwards. Robin was a girl who was known to be strong-willed and sometimes hot-headed. She had a history of running away and had been described by family as having an interest in older men. This may be why Robin, who was only 14 at the time, had taken an interest in David. Later that day, David dropped off Robin at home before returning to his own home with his brother and cousin. According to David's brother, he later left home again around midnight. Though no one could have known at the time, it was most likely that David had left to pick up Robin. The next day, David and Robin were missing. By September 21st, David's pickup truck had been found in the parking lot of the Ragged Island Refuge. The driver's side window had been partially rolled down. The radio was playing, the windshield wipers were on, and the key was in the ignition. Now, inside the truck were some scattered clothes, which were later determined to be the pair's underwear and shoes. In addition to this, a wallet had been left on on the dashboard. Officers believe that the scene before them told of a person who had just stepped away for a moment and was likely going to come right back. So in an attempt to be nice, they turned off the truck and left it where it had been found. It was later determined that the truck belonged to David Knobling, whose family believed that he had gone missing a couple of days previously. Sometime within the next 48 hours, the truck was towed by police back to David's father's house. An extensive 3-day search of the Ragged Island refuge was led by David's father and local officers. It wasn't until the 23rd that the bodies of David Knobling and Robin Edwards had been found. The bodies were located about 1 mile away from David's truck on the south shore of the James River Bridge. Robin had been found first, and a fair amount of bloating to her head, according to some reports at least, led people to believe that she may have been in the water for some time, as well as possibly David. Reports also differ somewhat on other details, but it seems that Robin's shirt and bra had been pulled up over her breasts, and while she was wearing pants, they may have been unzipped. Robin had died of a gunshot wound to the back of the head. David's body was nearby, and he was found only wearing pants. Unlike Robin, David had been shot twice, once to the back of the left shoulder and once to the back of the head. The shot to the shoulder led investigators to believe that he may have tried to run at some point and was stopped by the gunshot before he was ultimately executed by the shot to the back of his head. It is believed that the two may have died between 12:30 a.m. and 5:30 a.m., but a group of teenagers who had been partying in the area that night, they told investigators that David's car wasn't in the parking lot when they left around 2 a.m. It is believed by investigators and family members that David and Robin may have met up the night that they disappeared to find a secluded area to have sex. David was known in the past to go to the area to party, so it wouldn't have been completely unusual if he had brought Robin there. After the discovery of the bodies, David's truck was processed for evidence, but the fingerprints that had been collected from the vehicle were later lost. Due to the state of David and Robin's bodies, their partial undress, some theorize that the two had parked the truck and then wandered into the trees for a private spot. While they were there, they were attacked, and the killer may have tried to rob them. Again, Robin's wallet was apparently missing, and David's wallet was found on the dashboard of the truck, suggesting he could have left it behind. The suspect then shot Robin, and David may have tried to run at this point, but was gunned down as well. Another theory is that David and Robin were approached while they were getting intimate inside the vehicle, and then forced to get out and move past the parking lot where they were eventually murdered. Some believe another scenario similar to this may have occurred, but this time the killer drove the two out past the parking lot, and after murdering them, they returned the truck. While David and Robin's cases are believed by many to potentially be connected to the other Colonial Parkway murders, it is important to point out that the Ragged Island Refuge is about 20 miles away from the Colonial Parkway, at its nearest point, which is the pathway's southeasternmost end. This and the manner of death have led some to believe that David and Robin may not be connected to the others. The next couple believed to be possibly connected to the Colonial Parkway murders is Richard Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey. Richard Keith Call often preferred to go by his middle name, Keith, and Keith was described affectionately as a geek by his brother Doug because he greatly enjoyed computers and was even majoring in computer science at Christopher Newport College. Like Keith, Cassandra Hailey, who went by Sandy with her friends, was also a student at Christopher Newport College, which is now called Christopher Newport University. Cassandra had spent time modeling and doing gymnastics leading up to college. Now, it was the night of April 9th, 1988, when Keith picked up Sandy at her parents' house. The couple had told Sandy's parents that they were planning to go to a movie, but instead they attended a party on campus. They arrived at the party around 9 p.m. According to people at the party, Keith and Sandy didn't seem to be very interested in each other. They had both recently been in relationships, and Keith specifically had just recently broken up with his girlfriend of 4 years. It didn't appear that the two didn't get along in general, according to witnesses, but they didn't seem to be very interested in each other. There doesn't seem to be a for sure time that Keith and Sandy had left the party, but it was sometime around 1:30 to 2 in the morning on April 10th that they left. Now, the two haven't been seen since. The morning of April 10th, Keith's father was on his way to work when he drove past Keith's red Toyota Celica. The car had been parked on the York River overlook situated situated along the Colonial Parkway, and neither Keith or Sandy were inside. Robert Call had actually stopped to check the car and described it as looking fairly normal without a lot of belongings in the vehicle. Not yet knowing that his son was missing and believing that Keith and Sandy may be nearby on a walk or doing something that required more privacy, Robert Call decided to leave the car and continue on his way to work. Around 9 a.m. that morning, Park Service rangers reported Keith's car as abandoned. It was later discovered that the rangers had come upon Keith's car nearly 2 hours earlier, around 7 a.m. When they came across the car, the park ranger said that the driver's side door had been open, the windows were rolled down, the glove box was open, and the keys were in the ignition. Believing that the car had been abandoned, the rangers took the clothing that had been inside the back of the car and they took it to the ranger station, where they then tried to find out who it belonged to. While searching the clothes, they found Cassandra's checkbook and they called her home. This is when the park rangers discovered that Cassandra Hailey was actually missing. At this point, they knew that they had disturbed a possible crime scene, but instead of leaving the clothes be and refraining from potentially contaminating the scene further, the rangers actually returned to Keith's car and attempted to put the clothing back as they had found it. Even though the rangers now knew that a missing person may have been inside this car, they waited an entire day before calling the FBI. Something that is important to note about the car is that it wasn't revealed until years later that the park rangers had actually found the car around 7 in the morning. It turned out that the car had been found first by the park rangers, not by Keith's father. So when Robert Call came across the car, the driver's door had been already closed and the clothes that had been found inside the car had already been removed by the park rangers. Now, it was stated by the FBI that in this case in particular, the National Park Service had seemed to be secretive and uncooperative, likely to do with the fact that they had tampered with the crime scene, and then played dumb about the entire situation. This revelation about the park rangers' discovery of the car wasn't brought about until 20 years later, after Keith's and Sandy's disappearance. Now, one theory that seemed to be popular with park rangers was that Keith and Sandy may have stopped at the overlook, undressed, and then ventured to the water for skinny dipping. However, many people, including the family, dispute this theory. According to both Keith and Sandy's families, the two were very wary of the Colonial Parkway at night and wouldn't have gone there to be alone or for any other reason that late after the campus party. In addition to this, it was April in Virginia and the water would have been very cold at that time of year. It also didn't make sense that the two would have wanted to go swimming. They also would have needed to walk about a half mile from the car to get to the water's edge, so why would they undress at the car first? Now, in addition to this, it's been pointed out that it's unlikely that a couple who didn't seem to be enjoying their date together would then go out skinny dipping at 2 in the morning. The final couple originally connected to the Colonial Parkway murders is Daniel Lauer and Annamaria Phelps. Annamaria, who often went by Anna, was described as vibrant and energetic. She deeply loved her family and her life. Her mother was stated at one point that Anna was like an older sister to everyone she met. Anna had recently moved in with her fiancé, Clint Lauer, and leading up to Labor Day in '89, Anna and Clint had offered to let Clint's brother, Daniel Lauer, move in with them. Daniel had accepted the offer, and over Labor Day weekend, he had gone home to visit family and to pick up the first batch of things that he would be moving in to his brother and future sister-in-law's home. Anna had accompanied him on the trip, and on September 4th, the two were to return to Anna's home in Virginia Beach. They had left Daniel's parents' house at around 11:15 p.m. that night and had planned to take the I-64 all the way back to Virginia Beach. When Daniel and Anna didn't return home around the time expected, Clint called his mother to let her know that they hadn't shown up. Clint and Daniel's mother became worried and they called police to file a missing persons report. When the sun was up, Clint and a co-worker drove along the I-64 looking for Daniel's vehicle, a gold 72 Chevy Nova. The two spent hours searching, but as they came close to running out of gas, they decided it was time to turn around for the time being. Daniel's car was found on September 5th at the New Kent rest stop on I-64. The problem was that the car had been traveling on the wrong side of the road, and rather than stopping at the rest stop, which would have indicated that the two were driving in the direction of Virginia Beach, the car had been at the rest stop on the opposite side of the highway. Now, the car had been parked near a no parking sign in a portion of the lot that had been designated for larger trucks. It was a very unusual spot for a car like that to be left. Now, state transportation officials reported the vehicle and state troopers were about to have it towed when a missing persons report came in over the radio about 2 young adults who were last seen in a gold Chevy Nova. The doors to the vehicle were unlocked when it was initially discovered, with the driver's side window partway down and the keys were in the ignition. Daniel's belongings that he was moving into his brother's home were all still in the vehicle, with the exception of a heating blanket. Now, the gas tank was 3/4 full, and an inspection of the car proved that there had been nothing wrong, which would have required the two to pull off at the rest stop that night. There were signs that the car had been driven through a wooded area, which didn't make sense because the two had planned on taking the I-64 all the way home. Though the area around the rest stop had been thoroughly searched, there was no sign of Daniel or Anna. The search for the two stretched out for the next few weeks, and it was led by the Virginia State Police instead of the FBI because the vehicle had been located on a rest stop on a state highway. Investigators were able to determine that a possible sighting of the two had occurred the night that they were headed back to Virginia Beach. A trucker believed that he had seen the two at the same point on the highway that night, but instead of the westbound rest stop, the car had been in the eastbound rest stop, and he saw David and Anna there. This is the rest stop that would have actually made sense because it was the way that they would have been going if they were headed to Virginia Beach. Now, another sighting was reported. This time it occurred on the morning of September 5th, the first official day that they were missing. The person reporting the sighting claimed to have seen the two at the westbound rest stop that morning. Now, on October 19th, about 6 weeks after the disappearance, the skeletal remains of the couple were found by hunters. This was off the I-64 between Williamsburg and Virginia, and they were under a heating blanket. The bodies had been located on a logging road. It was about 30 miles from where the Colonial Parkway intersects with the I-64, and it wasn't far from the rest stop where Daniel's car had been found. Now, Anna's wallet was missing, though investigators did find her social security card and a miniature birth certificate near the bodies. In addition to this, Anna had been found wearing Daniel's socks and shoes. Daniel didn't have money on him that had been given to him by his father the night they left for Virginia Beach, which also hadn't been discovered in Daniel's car. The cause of death could not be determined from the remains as they had been badly decomposed during the past 6 weeks. There seemed to be possible stab wounds to Anna's body, but it was difficult to determine at first. Now, investigators also couldn't rule out gunshots, but later scans showed that the bodies likely indicated Anna had died of multiple stab wounds to her abdomen, and it's assumed that Daniel probably died in a similar way. Because there had been money and a wallet missing from Daniel and Anna, investigators were unable to rule out robbery in their case. Following Daniel and Anna's deaths, the Colonial Parkway murders seemed to cease. With this, the attention the cases were receiving also seemed to disappear in large. The case had gone completely cold until 2009. Fred Atwell was a former deputy sheriff from the area where the Colonial Parkways had occurred. However, he had never actually worked on the case himself. In the late 2000s, Atwell was asked to help with a training course for a security company and to speak about the Colonial Parkway murders. Now, it was reported that Atwell had told the company that while he was an officer at the time of the cases, he didn't have a lot of direct involvement in the investigations. It was at this point that the security company had mentioned that they were in the possession of photos from the crime scenes. In fact, there were 84 photographs related to the Colonial Parkway murders, which had been somehow leaked from the FBI. Atwell tried to bring this to the attention of the FBI, but they seemed largely indifferent. Atwell instead then went to the media with this information, which shined a bad spotlight on the FBI. Because of this public scrutinization, the FBI actually reopened the Colonial Parkway cases. This led some to describe Atwell as a sort of hero for bringing the cases back into the public eye. Unfortunately for Atwell, he had also situated himself as a potential suspect in the cases. One of the possible profiles of the killer for the Colonial Parkway murders was someone who was either an officer or posing as an officer. We'll discuss this theory in general soon, but for now let's focus on Atwell. When it came to this profile, Atwell fit it well, and the FBI turned their attention toward him. Atwell would soon make connections with the family members of the Parkway victims, and he developed a sort of obsession with the case. The investigation by the FBI seemed to bring a number of things in Atwell's life to a downward spiral. In September of 2011, Atwell was arrested for robbing a woman at gunpoint and stealing less than $100 from her. He reportedly told this victim that he was living in the woods and was hungry. According to Kathy's brother, Bill, Fred Atwell always tried to insert himself into the investigation and into the families. He would spin the most elaborate tales you've ever heard. Late January, he called me and said he had been contacted by an attorney outside the country who claimed to have a client who was involved in the murders. He said they wanted $20,000 to reveal the locations where Keith and Cassandra's bodies could be found. The tale got more fantastic as it went on. We were very skeptical, and at some point in the spring, he just dropped it. Bill has also said before that he sometimes wonders if Atwell knows more about the case than he is letting on, and he hoped that if he did, he would come forward with it. In 2012, it was revealed that Atwell had actually committed fraud by taking about $300 from a fund for the Parkway victims' families. The funds were supposedly raised to help hire a private investigator, but Atwell used the money on personal expenses. Atwell was sentenced to 3 years for this, but while in jail, he passed away. If he did in fact know anything more than he was saying about the murders, that information is now likely lost forever. Though Atwell fit the FBI profile of an officer being involved in the murders, it seems that the families didn't necessarily put a lot of stock into this theory that Atwell had anything to do with the Colonial Parkway murders. Now, at one point, a man named Ron Little told reporters that he was being investigated as a suspect for multiple disappearances and murders, including some from the Colonial Parkway murders. Little had at one point bought out a private investigation agency where he had previously worked. Two of the other people who had worked there at the same time as Little were Brian Pettinger and Benita Edwards. Brian was later murdered, and Little was claiming that he was being investigated for that murder, and Benita, on the other hand, was the mother of Robin Edwards. Now, Little came out with this claim while he was also being investigated for being an illegal alien. Little was actually from New Zealand, and he came to the United States and married someone in California, but eventually they divorced. Following the divorce, his request to become a U.S. citizen was denied, but Little stayed in the country anyway. It was later discovered that he was here illegally remaining in the country, and he was arrested. Now, Little would be released for a time being and allowed to stay in the U.S. while it was determined what would happen from that point forward. And during this time, Little was not allowed to work legally in the country. So this left him frustrated because he was allowed to stay in the country, but he wasn't allowed to work, and he wasn't just being deported back to New Zealand. So in the end, it was kind of like being in a limbo of sorts. Now, Little was ultimately deported in August of '89, which means that he at least could not be involved in all of the Colonial Parkway murders because the deaths of Daniel and Anna were actually after that point. However, he was in the United States during some of the murders, including some of the disappearances and murders that he was being investigated for outside of relation to the Colonial Parkway murders. Though there weren't many specific suspects to discuss in this case, there are a few theories we need to go over. One of the first theories is that an officer may have been involved. Pat Brown, a criminal profiler, believes that the person involved in the cases was either part of law enforcement or likely wished that they were. This is a somewhat common wish of serial killers, it seems. We know that Edmund Kemper and BTK, for example, both wished to be a part of law enforcement but were unable to. Brown says he wanted authority and probably did not have it. His crimes gave him this feeling. He was able to surprise, control, and punish wrongdoers. Blaine Pardoe is also partial to the officer theory. Important notes that he makes in relation to this theory is that the glove boxes of the cars were open, suggesting that the victims had been retrieving their registration to show someone they believed to be an officer, and the victims' wallets were found outside of their purses or their pockets, suggesting that they had gotten them out to show ID to an officer or somebody they believed to be an officer. There is also the fact that the driver's side windows were rolled down, indicating that the the cars had been approached by an officer. Now, if someone had been posing as an officer or even actually was one, they would have been able to easily convince their victims to get out of their cars. Now, a family member of Keith's, Joyce Call Canada, is quoted as saying, "I've always thought it was law enforcement or maybe someone posing as a cop. In all of these cases, you've got young, healthy teenagers and young adults who aren't just going to stand there and let someone overpower them, so it has to be someone that, at least for a moment, they could feel comfortable with." The officer theory seems to be the most largely accepted theory in this case, as it appears to explain a number of the strange things that were present at the different scenes. Another theory is that the crimes were committed by a team. As I discussed in my recent coverage of the West Mesa Bone Collector, there have been a number of team killers throughout the years, so it isn't out of the realm of possibility that a team of at least 2 people could have committed the crimes. One of the big things that leads people to believe that 2 people may have been involved is the first case. Kathy and Becky were both considered to be active and fairly strong women. On top of this, Kathy was a graduate of the Naval Academy and she was trained in the martial arts. It would have been difficult to control both of these women at the same time. Though one person may have been able to accomplish this with the threat of a gun, it's also likely that it may have required 2 killers, one to subdue each woman effectively to keep them from running while the other was being tied up. Another theory in the case is that someone from the CIA may have been involved. It was discovered that during the investigation, the Virginia State Police had actually investigated Camp Perry and its soldiers. Now, it was later revealed that this camp was actually a training facility for the CIA, and this led to rumors of a rogue CIA operative being involved. However, I've seen no other information that may be something to suggest that necessarily a CIA operative could have done this. Now, the last theory that we'll be discussing today is the multiple killers theory. Unlike the team killers theory, where a team of 2 people at least committed the murders together, this theory suggests that the murders actually aren't connected and were committed by multiple and unrelated killers. This theory is most explored by Steve Spingola. Steve Spingola is a former Milwaukee homicide detective who was asked by the families to look into the cases. Spingola has been reported by some news outlets as having been a private investigator hired by the families, but as he addresses in his own writings on the Colonial Parkway Murders, he simply served in a role as an investigative journalist. He was not paid as a private investigator. Now, he determined that the murders were committed by multiple people and weren't linked. According to Spingola, Kathy and Becky's murders were likely a hate crime because they were a lesbian couple. In fact, their case may be directly related to another murder of a lesbian couple, Julianne Williams and Laura Winans. On March 19, 1996, Julianne, better known as Julie, and Laura, better known as Lollie, had begun a hike of the Appalachian Trail, starting in the Shenandoah National Park. They had also brought along their golden retriever with them, Taj. On May 24th, the girls were last seen by a park ranger at the Stony Man parking lot around 5:30 p.m. After this, the 2 hadn't been seen again. The pair should have returned home by the end of the month. Julie had a job that she was expected to get back to, and Lollie had RSVP'd for the wedding of a friend on June 1st. Julie and Lollie's bodies were discovered on June 1st, 1996. They were located near the Skyline Lodge. One body had been outside of the girls' tent, the other had been inside. And this led investigators to believe that the suspect may have waited for one of the girls to leave the tent before attacking and then turning his attention to the other girl who was likely still asleep inside the tent. The girls' wrists had been bound and their throats had been slit. A piece of duct tape had been placed over one of the girls' mouths, and there were actually hairs on the sticky side of the tape that didn't belong to either victim. Now, there didn't seem to be any indication of sexual assault or robbery in the case, but the girls' dog was later found unharmed. Now, a year later, a man named Daryl Rice would become a suspect in the murders, but eventually physical evidence, including the hairs that had been on the duct tape, seemed to rule him out. The case is still unsolved to this day. Some theorize that Julie and Lollie's case is actually related to the Parkway murders, possibly committed by the same person, but others believe that if the case is connected connected in any way, it is only to Kathy and Becky's murders, which also involved the deaths of a lesbian couple and had been committed in a similar way. Now, this is the line of thought that Spingola takes, indicating that he believes that Kathy and Becky's murders had been a hate crime and that they may be connected to Julie and Lollie's murders, which he also believes had been a hate crime. Spingola then theorizes that David and Robin's murders were related to a robbery that had gotten out of hand. He also believes that Daniel and Anna may have been murdered after being robbed. It was revealed later in the investigation that Daniel's father had given him that money before Daniel and Anna left for Virginia Beach. In addition to this, after Spingola had gone to the area to investigate, Anna's sister decided to go through Anna's things, which she had kept but not gone through for decades. Inside these belongings was a note that Anna had written, which indicated that there had been a meeting planned with someone in a blue van at some point at a rest stop. There was also a number included with the note. Now, Daniel's car had been found at a rest stop, so could it be possible that Anna had been intending to meet someone at the rest stop on their way home? It is possible that she could have intended to meet someone, perhaps even to purchase marijuana, which would relate back to a roach clip that had been discovered in Daniel's car. So perhaps the person found out that Daniel had extra money on him and tried to rob them. When things went south, he murdered the couple, and the money that Daniel's father had given him that night was never recovered because it had been stolen. In the case of Keith and Sandy's disappearances, Spingola doesn't really give too much of a theory as to what he believes may have happened to them, as they have never been found. However, he does believe that their remains will eventually be discovered, most likely by a jogger or hunter in the Colonial Parkway area. In the end, it's hard to tell if each of these cases is connected. Maybe only some of the cases are connected. Maybe Julie and Lollie's murders are connected to Kathy and Becky's. Maybe none of the cases is connected and someone different is responsible in each case. So before I close out this video, let's just go over the similarities and differences in these cases. Each case involved two people, usually couples, with the slight exception of Daniel and Annamaria, though they may have also appeared as a couple to the killer. In 3 cases, the bodies had not been discovered far from the vehicles. Kathy and Becky's bodies had been in Kathy's car. David and Robin's bodies had been about 1 mile away from David's car. Daniel and Anna's bodies had been about 2 miles away from Daniel's car. The only possible exception to this is Keith and Sandy, whose bodies have never been found. With the exception of Kathy and Becky, who had been clothed when found, the other suspects were in various degrees of undress. A majority of the clothing in the other 3 cases had been found in the vehicles. In each case, the victims seemed to have possibly been forced out of their vehicles. Though we can't be certain that these couples may not have been inside of their vehicles at the time that they were confronted by the killer, we do know that the cars and the locations of the bodies are not where the murders took place. So all of the victims were either forced to leave their vehicles or were confronted while outside their vehicles and then possibly moved away from where they had been parked. The victims all roughly fit into the same age range of college-age kids. Kathy was slightly older than the rest, but she could have passed for college age. And the same with Robin, except for she was younger, but she was described as always appearing and acting older. Now, in most of the cases, the victims' cars seem to have been left poised for theft. In the first case, Kathy's car had been pushed down into a ravine, but after that, the cars had been left in normal spots, an overlook, a parking lot, a rest stop off the highway. In these cases, the cars had been discovered unlocked with windows or car doors left open and keys in the ignition, as if the killer may have been hoping that someone would come upon the car and steal it. There were a lot of similarities between these cases, but what about differences? Now, the couples were killed in different manners. Kathy and Becky had been strangled and then their throats had been slit. David and Robin had been shot. We don't know the cause of death for certain for Keith and Sandy, as they were never found, but Daniel and Anna were most likely stabbed. Though these cases are called the Colonial Parkway Murders, not all of the disappearances and murders occurred on the parkway itself. It's hard to say where each couple may have been intercepted, as we know that they were killed somewhere other than where their bodies were discovered and where their cars had been left. So there is a chance that the victims encountered their killers on the Parkway, but the linked murders are more so referred to as the Colonial Parkway Murders because the crimes seem to happen near enough to the Parkway. The Colonial Parkway was essentially situated right through the center of the areas in which these crimes occurred. Kathy and Becky had been found on the Parkway, but David and Robin had been found out at the Ragged Island Refuge. Now, this was somewhat southwest of the Parkway. Then Keith's car had been located on the Colonial Parkway at the York River Overlook, around a mile from where Kathy's car had been found. After this, Daniel's car was discovered at the rest stop off the I-64 northwest of where it intersects with the Colonial Parkway. So at least 2 of the cases involved cars and bodies being discovered south or north of the Colonial Parkway itself. So we may never know who committed these crimes and whether or not they are truly connected. In 2018, though, it was reported that DNA from 3 out of the 4 cases was being tested. Hopefully further analysis will help to solve some of the mysteries in this case. Now, a number of the family members of the victims have passed away since the 80s, never having learned who had hurt their loved ones. But there are still loved ones out there trying to solve the cases. There are 2 Facebook groups run by family members of some of the victims, which I will link in the description box down below. Now, they have a plethora of information about these cases, and they've also shared a lot of information about other cases and how DNA is helping to solve a slew of cold cases these days. I would highly suggest checking out these pages to learn more about the Colonial Parkway murders. I would also like to stress that while it is believed that many of these cases may be connected, we need to keep in mind that they also might not be connected at all. It's important that we went through each case individually today, because each victim deserves to have their story told and listened to. And we do this in the hopes that whether or not these cases are connected, someone will realize that they may have information related to one of the cases and they may come forward with it. Now, I've done my best to present you with the most accurate representation of each of these cases, but I feel it's important to let you know that the reporting on these cases from the moments that they occurred was not always accurate. I had to do a lot of digging through the Facebook group pages to see what information family members knew to be false or misrepresented. So I've given you the most accurate information that I could, but with full transparency, there's always the chance that I have gotten something wrong. So this case in particular has been challenging to ensure that everything I present to you is as factual as possible. So please turn to the Facebook groups for further clarification if you feel that you need it. So what are your thoughts on today's case? This was very difficult to cover, and it took so much more time than I was expecting, which is why I ultimately decided to cut out 2 cases from Hollow Week. But I wanted to make sure that I could finish the research in this case and do a presentation on it for you that was as accurate as possible. I'm undecided if all of these cases are connected, but I definitely see how they possibly could be connected. I also feel like someone may be posing as an officer and that they're related to this case. Honestly, it's just the way that the cars were left felt really eerie to me. But I would really like to know what your guys' thoughts on the case is. Do you think that they were all connected, that just some of them are, or maybe not even any of them? I would definitely like to hear what your guys' thoughts are in the comments down below. Just remember, as always, to remain respectful. And as always, please share this video, someone else's video, the Facebook groups, or any of the sources provided down below to help keep this case in the public eye. Someone somewhere likely knows something, and by sharing these stories, we may reach them and convince them to come forward with that information, which could crack the case wide open. So thank you so much for watching today's video, and I will see you all again soon for another case.